During the 1910s, Uruguay went through several major political transformations. It adopted universal male suffrage beginning in 1916, becoming the second country in Latin America to develop a democracy that survived for more than a decade. Around this same time, the government also enacted one of the boldest economic and social reform agendas in Latin American history. And Uruguay emerged from this process with the first welfare state in Latin America. However, this video is going to focus on a different set of transformations that occurred within Uruguay's political parties themselves. During the 1910s and early 20s, both traditional parties, but especially the ruling Colorado Party, transformed into mass political organizations with a large and stable base of popular support. They develop neighborhood party organizations that integrate citizens from all classes into party politics, and the reformist wing of the Colorado Party also develops a party structure that grants the neighborhood party activists an unusually central voice in running the party from day to day. The main objective of this video is to explain how these changes within the Colorado Party came about. Though as we will see, these party transformations are closely intertwined with the broader set of reforms that are happening in Uruguay at this time. The democratization of the Colorado Party is a reaction to both the opportunities and the failures of the broader reform agenda. All of these reforms were top-down reforms that were implemented at the insistence of Uruguay's president José Batlle y Ordóñez, and many accounts of Uruguay's political history during this era naturally center on the personality and aims of Batlle himself. José Batlle is often portrayed as a determined visionary who saw it as his mission to drag Uruguay kicking and screaming into the modern era and refashion it into a model country for the rest of the world to follow. Others see the Batllista reforms as a reaction to the growing militancy of the Uruguayan anarchist labor movement. In this account, the reforms were an attempt to avert a revolutionary uprising down the road by undercutting the anarchist movement and addressing the workers' basic demands. I think both of these explanations are partly correct, but as I am going to show, Batlles's decision to democratize the Colorado Party was also shaped by the internal politics of the party itself and the complications that the party's fracturing posed for the rest of his reform agenda. José Batlle was the son of the former president Lorenzo Batlle, whom we met in an earlier video. He was the guy who was in power when the Blanco Party launched the Revolution of the Lances in the early 1870s. While this connection might seem to make the younger Batlle political royalty, the unpopularity of Lorenzo among the rest of the party leads José Batlle to be excluded from power throughout the late 19th century. Shortly after the Revolution of the Lances ends, the military seizes power and Uruguay is governed by a succession of Colorado military leaders. José Batlle is eventually forced into exile after he participates in an unsuccessful revolution against the military regime. Uruguay transitions back to civilian rule in 1890, but José Batlle still finds himself on the outside because he is considered too populist and dangerous by the group of civilians who now run the party and the country. In a bid to gain power, Batlle leans into his populism during the 1890s, and he works to cultivate a base of mass support. He starts an opposition newspaper called El Dia, where he outlines a progressive vision for the country. And it is in this newspaper that he first floats the idea of democratizing the Colorado Party. In an 1892 editorial, he calls for the party to become a truly popular party in which all of its members, even those of the most humble social and political position, may express their voice on a regular basis. The Colorado Party at this time was essentially a political machine that was tightly controlled from the top down by the president, Julio Herrera y Ordóñez, and his successors. Batlle is suggesting that the party should instead be reorganized in a more democratic fashion, in which a system of local political clubs would be responsible for electing the party leadership and selecting the party's candidates for all offices. This proposal is very much in line with Batlle's populism during this era, but this type of reorganization would also be to Batlle's personal political advantage. By this point, Batlle is the most popular politician among the Colorado masses, and he expects that he would emerge as the leading figure within the party if those masses actually had some voice in the party's internal politics. The party's current leader, Herrera y Ordóñez, naturally ignores this proposal, but Batlle begins organizing a network of political clubs on his own initiative. Batlle's popular support does play a role in his rise to power, but his rise also involves a certain degree of political violence. In 1897, one of Batlle's supporters assassinates the president on his way out of church. Power passes to a provisional president named Juan Lindolfo Cuestas, who promptly stages a self-coup that is supported by Batlle and his political clubs. Cuestas closes the Congress, and in this way, he and Batlle remove the previous dominant faction of the party led by Herrera y Ordóñez from its positions of power in the government. In effect, Cuestas' self-coup enables a second internal coup within the Colorado Party that places the party under Cuestas and Batlle's control. These coups bring Batlle into the governing coalition for the first time, and when Cuestas steps down from power in 1903, Batlle is chosen to succeed him as president. Upon taking office, Batlle immediately provokes the opposition Blanco party into a revolt, and the government decisively defeats the Blanco rebel armies. The main Blanco military leader, Aparicio Sarabia, is killed during this fighting, and the government victory enables Batlle to break off the power-sharing arrangement with the Blanco party, remove the Blanco intendants from their positions in local government, and replace them with Batlle's own allies from the Colorado Party. And so by the end of 1904, Batlle is triumphant. He has crushed all of his enemies, and there is no longer any viable opposition to him within the institutions of government. Batlle has the political capital to do whatever he wants during his first term as president, and so this is the moment of truth that will reveal whether Batlle truly meant what he said earlier about democratizing the Colorado Party. And what Batlle shows is that he is not especially interested in allowing the party to become a truly autonomous and democratic organization that might serve as a check on his power. Batlle does institutionalize the role of the clubs within the party organization, but the clubs themselves remain very weakly organized and ineffectual. Far from spontaneous groupings of citizens, most clubs are organized and controlled by individual politicians within Batlle's political network. The clubs do not usually stick around after elections are over, and when they are in session, the club meetings are infrequent and heavily scripted in advance. They are not forums for genuine political debate. As a result, very few people bother to participate in these clubs at all. When the party holds its first internal election, most of the clubs fail to meet quorum, and they have to redo the election, and this time they make sure to pass out food and drink at the clubs so that people will actually show up to vote. During Batlle first term as president, the clubs are mostly a tool for legitimizing his rule and institutionalizing his popular support within the party. But the way that they function is very far from the democratic vision that Batlle had outlined a decade earlier while he was still in the opposition. When Batlle's term as president ends in 1907, he passes power to a close ally named Claudio Williman, who passes power back to Batlle in 1911. Batlle spends most of Williman's term on an extended vacation in Europe, and he returns to Uruguay in 1911 with a much clearer vision of how he wants to transform the country during his second term. It is during this second term that Batlle implements the most famous parts of his reform agenda. He has the Congress enact a series of labor legislation that includes an 8-hour workday, a system of workers' comp, and a prohibition of child labor. Batlle's second government also creates the beginnings of a welfare state in Uruguay by establishing an employment insurance system, a pension system, and a free public education system. Batlle also expands the role of the state in the economy by nationalizing much of the country's financial sector and by establishing new state-owned enterprises, including state-owned electricity and railroad companies. Batlle sees these reforms as a way to undercut more radical political movements such as the anarchists, while also mobilizing lower-class citizens into the governing Colorado Party. But this agenda faces considerable resistance from other elites within the party, who now accuse Batlle of being a socialist. Batlle knows that other politicians within the Colorado Party will try to roll back these reforms as soon as he leaves office. And so Batlle attempts to lock in these social and economic reforms by coupling them with two important political reforms. First, the remaining property and literacy restrictions on voting will be eliminated, and Uruguay will become a democracy with universal suffrage. The reasoning is that since Batlle's economic and social agenda is most popular among the working class masses, these reforms will be more likely to survive a conservative backlash if these masses are incorporated into the political system and given the right to vote. For safe measure, Batlle also hopes to abolish the presidency outright and replace it with an executive council known as the Colegiado, which would initially be filled with Batlle's allies within the Colorado Party. While a single president would have the power to reverse Batlle's reforms, a plural executive that divides power across several different people would have a much harder time coordinating on rolling back the Batllista reform agenda. Near the end of Batlle's second term, the Colorado Party finally suffers a definitive split when the party's right wing breaks away from the rest of the party. The right wing now calls itself the anticolegialistas, which implies that the thing that they are opposing is Batlle's Colegiado, or the plural executive. But in reality, their main grievance is over Batlle's radical economic reforms. The conservative sector of the party consists of many of the Colorado Party's wealthiest landowners and businessmen, and it is backed by many of the country's leading business interests, along with several foreign-owned companies that are upset over the Batllista nationalizations. Meanwhile, Batlle also has to contend with a resurgent Blanco party, which now calls itself the National Party. Under the leadership of Luis Alberto de Herrera, the National Party has renounced its revolutionary strategy, and it has reorganized as a mass political party rooted in the small towns and villages of Uruguay's interior. Despite this growing opposition, Batlle's wing of the Colorado Party still controls the Congress for now. And so when Batllier's term as president expires in 1915, he is able to get another ally named Batlle elected to succeed him as president. In Batllier's view, Batllier's main task is to oversee the drafting of a new constitution for Uruguay that would enshrine universal suffrage and the new plural executive, the Colegiado. The 1916 election for the Constitutional Assembly is Uruguay's first election with universal male suffrage, and it is a big test for whether Batlle has succeeded at mobilizing a majority of the country behind his reformist wing of the Colorado Party. And in the end, it turns out that he really hasn't. The Batllista branch of the party wins a disappointing 41% of the seats in the assembly, while the right-wing Colorados win 10% and the reorganized National Party wins 47%. Batlle has lost the country's first democratic election, and the country's right-wing newspapers soon mock him by calling this election result the death of Batlle. Batllier's enemies now control a comfortable majority in the Constitutional Assembly, so Batllier's more ambitious constitutional reforms are now completely off the table. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about this election result is where Batllier's minority of the vote is coming from. Part of the reason why Batlle insisted on expanding suffrage to lower-class voters was because he expected that lower-class Uruguayans would back a government that had just enacted the most progressive reform agenda in the nation's history. However, the precinct-level results from this election suggest that Batllier's electoral support was actually strongest among the more well-off sectors of the population that already had the right to vote prior to 1916. This graph shows the relationship between the Batllista vote share and the class composition of the precinct in the capital city of Montevideo. The x-axis, or horizontal axis, is the share of the electorate that was illiterate, while the numbers in the graph refer to a classification of the precinct's class balance, with lower numbers indicating a more working-class precinct. And what we see in this graph is that Batllier's party performed better in the more middle-class and better educated precincts, while it got some of its lowest vote shares in the precincts that had more lower-class and illiterate voters. In the aftermath of this electoral disaster, things get even worse for Batlle because his hand-picked successor as president, Feliciano Batlle, immediately breaks from Batlle, he purges the Batllistas from their positions in the government, and he aligns himself with the conservative wing of the Colorado Party. So by the late 1910s, Batlle is back where he started. He is marginalized from his own party's government. Batlle is in his 60s by this point, and many people in Uruguay expected him to retire from politics in defeat. But instead, Batlle returns to party building in a last-ditch attempt to salvage his earlier reforms. The Colorado Party had already split into two separate organizations, and Batlle decides to create a third Colorado Party organization called the Batllista Colorado Party. The main Colorado Party, led by Batlle, controls all of the patronage of the state, but the Batllista Party has the loyalty of most of the Colorado political clubs, and Batlle hopes to ride their support back into power. However, he recognizes that for this strategy to work, he will need to revitalize the clubs and transform them into spaces of genuine popular participation in Colorado Party politics. And so as the next election approaches, Batlle admits that yes, he has done a pretty poor job of involving the club activists in the governing process in the past, but he also promises that this time will be different. From now on, the people themselves shall take part in the debates within the party. The masses shall make their views known without constraints or impose discipline. They shall comprise the clubs, determine the party's positions, and secure the party's victory at the polls. In many ways, this resembles Batlle's rhetoric back in the 1890s, but this time he follows through on his promise to democratize his party. In the new Batllista party, the neighborhood clubs end up with a much more central role in party affairs than they had during Batlle's earlier presidencies. Among other things, they are responsible for electing delegates to the party convention, which in turn selects the party's candidates for executive office and the national party leadership. On its own, this structure does not look all that different from what we have already seen in other Latin American parties, like the Chilean Radical Party. But the true innovation of the Batllista party lies in the central role that the party convention plays in governing the party. In most parties of that era, a national convention would convene only once every couple of years, while the responsibility of running the party from day to day would fall to a much smaller group of senior politicians who would form the party's directory or executive committee. However, the Batllista convention quickly becomes a permanent body that convenes around once a week throughout the 1920s. The Batllista party's national executive committee ends up being quite powerless in practice, and instead the Batllista convention is the forum where all of the party's most important debates take place and where the major decisions that shape the party get made. And don't forget that the delegates to this convention are mostly very low-level neighborhood party club activists from non-elite backgrounds. It is incredibly rare for any political party during this era to grant working-class activists this much voice in party decisions, and it is especially rare for an elite party like the Colorado Party to do this. The central role of the Batllista convention in the party also enhances the power of the neighborhood political clubs that the convention delegates come from. During the 1920s, these clubs now organize themselves on a permanent basis, and many of them pass on instructions and advice to their delegates in the convention. It is around this time that the club activists start referring to their clubs as citizenship schools, and many of them believe that the club's most important mission is to draw their lower class and recently enfranchised neighbors into Batllista politics and transform them into effective citizens by involving them in the major political debates that are shaping the party and the country. The Batllista party structure still gives José Batlle himself a great deal of informal influence in the party, but despite the party's name, this is not really a personalistic party. Especially by the late 1920s, the convention becomes more assertive and less likely to simply fall in line behind what Batlle and the other senior politicians want. And we also start to see new ideological currents develop within the Batllista party. While many of the older Batllista politicians see the Batllista reforms as something that happened in the past, many of the younger Batllista activists who worked their way up from the clubs into the convention believe that the reform process is just getting started, and they intend to continue pushing the party to the left on both economic and social issues. One of the most important activists of this younger generation is a young man named Julio Cesar Grauert, who was only a child when the Batllista reform process began in the early 1910s. He distinguishes himself on the floor of the Batllista convention during the 1920s, and he leverages his popularity among the other delegates to become first a city councilor and then a congressman at the age of only 26. After Batlle dies in 1929, Grauert founds his own socialist faction within the Batllista party called Avanzar, which openly calls for the socialization of the means of production, along with various other measures such as worker housing and the abolition of the Senate. For now, Avanzar is just a single faction in one of several offshoots of the now deeply fractured Colorado Party. But the young leftist party activists who cut their teeth in Avanzar in the 1930s continue working their way up through the party's ranks over the following decades. And many of them end up running both the reunified Colorado Party and the country itself throughout much of the 1950s and 60s. This sort of internal mobility is not only possible but quite common in an internally democratic party that lets its base activists shape the party's destiny.